Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Guru-Murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. My guest this week is very much about ideas because he's the director of the Centreright think tank Onward. But before that, Sebastian Payne was a journalist, principally for the Financial Times, and he's written two books, one about the Red Wall and how that went to the Conservatives, and another about the fall of Boris Johnson, which is subtitled The Full Story, which we can explore a little bit. But Seb, thank you very much indeed for joining us. I mean, you've gone from journalism into ideas and policy, and I wonder whether it's a bit of what Boris Johnson said about leaving journalism, which is nobody puts statues up to journalists.
I think the reason that I made the jump, first of all, it was a great opportunity, first of all, to take over Onward. But fundamentally, I've spent 12 years as a political journalist, 7 at the Financial Times. And I kind of look at where the country is now and just think there's a dearth of big ideas. People are not looking about how to fix these big problems. And a lot of the media debate has become quite small-minded in terms of the ups and downs, focusing on just the horse race of who's up, who's behind. And I think when the opportunity came along to take over as director of a preeminent centre-right think tank, which values align with my values, I felt like you couldn't possibly turn down this idea, because if you've got people who are not exploring these bigger problems and challenges with the country, then no one will. And having done political journalism, yes, of course, Krishnan, like you're observing from the sidelines, from the press gallery, from the newsroom, and you look at people who are trading in the ideas day to day. And of course, a part of you thinks, well, actually, I would like to get a bit stuck into that.
And have you personally always been a Conservative?
I would say my worldview has always been shaped on the centre-right, that I think I grew up in one of the towns that I explored in, Broken Heartlands in Gateshead, and I think it was totally homogenous Labour, that the council was always Labour, you always had Labour MPs, and for most of my knowing life, it was a Labour government from the age of 7, the first election I remember going to the ballot box to, until 2010, which was the first election I voted in. So everything was Labour. And I think when I looked at life in Gateshead, and this was reflective of many other sort of Red Wall Tories, you might say, is you think, well, hang on a minute, you guys have been in power a long time, things have not fundamentally changed, they've not got better. And when I've looked at the kind of solutions for places like Gateshead and the towns I visited in Broken Heartlands, it doesn't feel me the answer is always the state does more. It's not always pouring more money into it. You've got to be more imaginative about how you deliver outcomes, and that again is what tipped me on the centre-right of the spectrum.
So do you think you've always been on this trajectory? I mean, I'm imagining in a few years' time you'll be a Conservative MP, and and possibly be in government. You're very sort of reminiscent of someone like Michael Gove, who's sort of had a background in journalism and but been a big thinker and then ends up in politics. Is that where you think you're heading?
Well, obviously, at the moment, I'm very busy running the preeminent centre-right think tank. That's all my focus is on at the moment. Is that something I might ever think about in the future? Who knows what the future holds? But for now, I think with Onward, we've got this 18-month window until the next election, where at the moment we are trying to make the biggest difference we can with the government and the ideas need to be shaped. Then, of course, there'll be the manifesto process. So really, Onward's all I'm thinking about at the moment.
Because, you might say it's a slightly odd time to go into sort of centre-right ideas, because, we're in a sort of arguably sort of the fag end of a Conservative period of government. It's not exhibiting a huge number of new ideas at the moment, and it's sort of preoccupied with sort of exhibiting competence, because that's what it's lost under the Boris Johnson period. So is this when you're thinking about what ideas should be embraced, are you really thinking about the next election, or is this sort of a longer term? Are you thinking about what happens to the Conservative Party in opposition if they lose the next election?
Well, our focus at Onward is very much about the here and now. And I actually think this is the best time to be getting stuck into centre-right ideas, because we've gone through a pretty turbulent period in terms of governing, 3 prime ministers in 12 months. But now what Rishi Sunak's doing in government is focusing, as you said, on that 5-point plan. But when you look beyond that, which will probably be some point in 2024, when we start to look towards a general election, there will be that need for new, fresh ideas and thinking. And the Conservative Party party's obviously won 4 elections. It wants to win a 5th election, which would be unprecedented. And to do that, it is going to require fresh ideas and a fresh way of doing things. And when you look at what we do at Onward, our raison d'etre very much is about levelling up and about trying to deal with those longer-standing regional inequalities. And the fact is that there are just too many parts of this country that don't have enough equality of opportunity. And that is what really drives me.
So I mean, when did you become interested in politics? As a little kid or what?
It was very early in my life that I grew up in Gateshead, as I said, in the northeast of England. And
what kind of childhood was it?
So
what did your parents do?
So I was born in 1989, and my mother was a teacher for 43 years, and my father was a small businessman. And I grew up in this household where we were, it was a very straightforward middle class household. But I had a sister who died a year before I was born, and my early years of my life were my father campaigning about her death. That there was an incinerator in Eastern Gateshead near where we lived that was pumping out toxic emissions, and he'd found a cluster of children who had been diagnosed with various awful cancers. And my sister died in 1988, and he was convinced and found evidence that the incinerator had been operating without crown immunity, as it was called. So it was being allowed to burn toxic waste. And so the first part of my childhood was all about that campaign, and eventually he succeeded. So number 1, the incinerator was shut down and was blown up, and number 2, plans for a super incinerator were not built. And so that was the kind of background to that. My father...
That's a very early lesson in the power of activism then.
And also, I think the crucial thing which has really driven my worldview, which is the power of people who feel forgotten by the system. Michael Gove gave this lecture in 2020 called The Privilege of Public Service. It was all about what the state, what government is there to do. And it was that lecture that drove me to write Broken Heartlands. And in that piece, he talked about FDR's forgotten man. And that was his concept in the 1930s of the pyramid of interests within American society. And essentially, the fact that, that if you looked at who was doing best and who was doing worst after the Depression, there was that bottom cadre of people who were always being forgotten by the structures. And his New Deal was all about fixing that. What Michael Gove was saying is in the post-Brexit, post-pandemic world, those are the people we've got to focus on. And so when I was looking back at my childhood and the campaign that my father fought, it was a very difficult thing, again, not coming from a hugely moneyed background, to find the money to fight that campaign. I was very reflective of, the idea this is someone who had a straightforward life but did not have an experience in campaign. I actually dedicated Broken Heartlands to him as a reluctant fighter, because it was not something he wanted to do, but it was driven by his circumstances. But my father died when I was 8, so from then onwards I was brought up in a single parent household by my mother, who continued to teach until she retired in 2010.
And were they political?
Not really. And I discussed this a bit in Broken Heartlands, that my father was instinctively Labour. He came from a working class background in Gateshead. My mother was instinctively Conservative. And my first political memory was walking to the polling station in 1997. And I was literally standing between them with him on the left, her on the right, physically and literally, and went into the polling station. And my mother still voted Conservative, despite being Gateshead, where there's really not a huge amount of point in doing that. And I reflected on this many years later, because I thought, come Brexit, they would have both been instinctively Brexit. I obviously don't know for my father, but come 2019, they probably both would have voted for Boris Johnson. And for me, that symbolises the realignment we've seen since 2016. The people from sort of the left and the right actually came together. It was much more about place and about age than the traditional social structures, but no kind of beyond that activism of my early years. But I guess I was always in a household where people, the news was on, Channel 4 News, newspapers. They were very engaged with the current affairs family, and I guess that's continued in my family since I've gone into this realm.
Tell me a little bit about your dad and about losing your dad at 8. I mean, that's an incredibly formative time to lose your father.
So he was born in 1941, and so he was a little bit older than most fathers, and he'd had years of ill health on and off up until that point. And I think for the last year or 18 months of his life, he was clearly pretty unwell. And I think it was just came to the point when obviously it was clear that he really was not that based. There was a point I can remember when I was aware that he was not going to be around in the future, that he was clearly very unwell, until we came to the final days when he was taken to hospital and all that sort of thing. My main memory was at primary school. So I was in year 5 and I was 8 years old at that point, 9 years old, I should say, sorry. And I just remember it's something that makes you stand out at school, because when you're in a class of, I think, 32 people, everyone is kind of the same. And then suddenly you've got this thing when you're a little bit different. I had some time out from school. And I remember going back to school was a very weird period, because at that point you were sort of like, this big thing's happened to you, but you pick it on. And you just pick up and you go on. I was very lucky to have a wonderful family, a very caring mother and aunts and uncles and friends and family friends. And I'm still incredibly close and fond to all of them, because they provided that support network that resulted after that as well.
You talked about your parents and how they might have voted in 2019. And you do believe, don't you, that there has been a realignment of politics around values rather than just the old tribal loyalties. Just explain why you think that's the case now.
So the argument that I charted about what's happened in UK politics is that obviously these places that voted for the Conservative Party for the first time ever, or since the Second World War in 2019, their cultural and economic base has changed. That many people's mindsets are that they had heavy industries and now they've just been on a downward slope for a long period of time. I don't think that's the case. When I talked about Concert earlier, when you go to Concert now, yes, its high street suffers some of the similar structural issues other high streets do, but it's got big private housing estate. It's got a lot of small manufacturing. And in some ways, this is the long tail effect of Thatcherism to replace that big, often nationalized industrial base with a smaller, more diversified private sector, service-based economy. And I think that has created people who are more naturally conservative leaning in their outlook. And you've obviously seen this in other parts of the country, obviously in Kent and Essex in the 1980s. But there was a more latent effect elsewhere in the country because, a lot of these places had industries that shut down and there simply wasn't enough done to replace them. And when I interviewed Lord Norman Tebbit for the book, who obviously was Employment Secretary in the 1980s, he comes as close to admitting as he ever would that when, the coal mines and the steelworks and all those things shut down, there wasn't enough done to fill that gap. But that has now happened over a 4-decade period. And when you look at what happened since 2010, a lot of those natural Labour voters have sort of disaggregated from the party. And a lot of them, first of all, went to UKIP. That was their source of disenfranchisement with politics. So they went to UKIP. Then they voted for Brexit. And then they got to the point where you had Jeremy Corbyn as the Labour Party leader, who culturally, aesthetically was out of step with these places. But then on the single issue they cared about the most, Brexit, he just didn't have anything to say, really. Labour's position in 2019 was just to sit on the fence.
Well, because he couldn't say what he really thought, perhaps.
Which was to get on with Brexit. Yes. That's what he wanted to do. But what you saw was this sort of disconnection had happened gradually. And what I talk about it is the Hampstead to Humberside alliance, because those were the foundations the Labour Party was built on. Metropolitan liberal intellectuals and, more rural working class part, the Hampstead, the Humberside. Brexit eroded that. It went straight down the middle. And I think maybe that bridge can be rebuilt. Maybe there can be a new message to that. But you can't just assume those people are automatically going to go back once they've had their sort of they've expressed their annoyance with where Labour was.
Well, this is what I wanted to raise with you, because, the analysis at the end of Broken Heartlands is that. And I think, and that idea of a sort of fundamental realignment of British politics was very much the story of the Cummings, Johnson years. And I wonder whether that was then and this is now. And that actually what we're about to see is the old alignment of British politics reassert itself, and that we're going to get quite a traditional split of who votes for who and where.
Well, I don't agree with that, because I think, first of all, the Conservative Party aspires to be a one-nation party, and that is used quite a lot, but what that actually means is representing the values and the aspirations of the whole of society, which is the blue wall in the south, but also the red wall in the north as well. And as I said, this wasn't just a one-off event in 2019. It had been happening gradually over decades. And if you look at how Labour voters had moved away from the party, actually from 2001 onwards, if you want to go further from that as well, but also the fact as well, this is reflected in other left-wing parties across Western countries, that this is not just a British phenomena, that essentially the metropolitan versus the more provincial, those are quite different divides because they've got different social aspirations, they've got different work aspirations as well. It may well be, we'll see what happens the next election. I still think the next election is 18 months away. A lot can happen within that period, but within that time frame, I still think the Conservative Party is now the Brexit Party. It represents Brexit and Brexit supporting voters. I don't think that's automatically going to change, although Brexit is starting to move away as being a salient dividing line within politics. But I think that realignment matters because ultimately I said, what drives me? What is important to me? That is equality of opportunity, because that is what conservatism should be about. And who needs equality equalised the most? It's those parts of the country that did not have the support during the deindustrialisation era over the last 40 years. So I think it would be a mistake for the Conservative Party just to flip back to 2010, its traditional voting base. It has to lean into the realignment and has to continue to make sure its policies and outlook is speaking to that. And I think Rishi Sunak believes in levelling up. The fact is, from his constituency in North Yorkshire, you can see the Tees Valley. You can see all the new work that's being done to clear the steelworks and bring in new industries to level up in a way. So I think he believes in levelling up as strongly as Boris Johnson did. And also that aspiration is what Theresa May did with the jams, the just about managings, which was forgotten due to Brexit. But that analysis has been in Conservative thinking for quite some time now, and I don't think it's going to go away. And it would be a massive mistake if the party decide to drop it. And I just don't think it's going to.
Yes, although I suppose the problem is Brexit, I'm sure, will continue to be a sort of a defining feature of British politics for, generations perhaps. But I mean, but in terms of values, it's quite hard, isn't it, for the Conservative Party to argue on values at the next election, for example, on things like immigration, when people haven't got on immigration what they thought they were going to get after Brexit. And that immigration numbers are enormous, legal immigration as well as illegal immigration. But even legal immigration numbers are massive, probably much higher than people thought they would be back in 2016.
Well, the figures last year, as you know, have got some particular circumstances due to obviously Ukraine, Afghanistan, leading to a particularly high bump at that point. My view on immigration is that it's all about control. And I think, people who talk about tens of thousands, that's not helpful. What people do want is to say that there is a border system that works, that you can see that the state is actually functioning in a good way. Conservative thinking said 20 years ago, we shouldn't have ID cards. I think there is now a very strong case for ID cards because you've got to show that people can control the nation state and that you know what's coming in and out. It's a fundamental tenet for a lot of voters. But, we'll see where we get to the next election. That's what the government's 5-point plan is about, is showing that these kind of 5 areas, which they think people want to lean into, are actually being delivered at that point. And we're expecting this plan on small boats to come in the coming weeks from the government. And it will be judged on the success of that, of otherwise. But, from my travels and the people that I've spoken to around the country about immigration, which was a huge part of the Brexit vote. It is about that sense of control. And I think if you can deliver that and show that, people will be more willing to accept higher numbers than some politicians have suggested.
What do you think the defining values then of conservatism should be?
First of all, I'm going to come back to this again, which is equality of opportunity, to make sure that wherever you are, whoever you are in this country, you've got the best opportunity to succeed in life. Because at the moment, I think, intelligence is equally distributed across the country, but equality is simply not. And I think you can see that, and I've seen that through my own career and things that I've done. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is localism, that both Onward and the books that I've written, I strongly believe that we have to decentralize power rapidly and massively across this country. The directly elected elected mayors, I think are the best innovation we've seen over the last 10 years in this country, and we've got more of them coming. I would like to see the House of Lords abolished and have all those mayors sit in a kind of upper chamber Senate, not elected as Labour's proposing, because I think that creates the US system where it gets very difficult, but have an upper chamber that is truly representing the different parts of England as well. And then the third tenet is actually economic growth. And I think that obviously Liz Truss went too far, too fast, and not doing it carefully enough. But if we don't get growth back up to 2% or even higher levels in this country, then we're going to have big problems for the structure of the welfare state, for our public services in the future. And for me, all those three things come together. You deliver more equality of opportunity by devolution, by allowing local mayors to decide skills, potentially even having tax powers. You deliver more growth by more localism in these different places. So they all knit together in a way that reshapes Britain in what is fundamentally a quite conservative idea of putting power close to people and away from Westminster.
I mean, it's just striking to me. All of those things could just as easily be described as new Labour values. You know, all those three things that you've talked about are things that Keir Starmer would be very comfortable with. So I wonder why you sort of nail them to the Conservative mast rather than as just ideas that you would like anybody to pick up. You know, is it because you do have a tribal conservatism?
Not at all. And I think if I go back to what the work we do at Onward, as I said, we work with politicians across the spectrum on this. And if you know...
But you see what I'm saying? It's sort of, you know, those three things are not, I think, what most people would argue are defining conservative values.
But I think they are. No, I think they are. Because first of all, the localism agenda, that is a very core conservative principle about putting power closer to people.
And it will be key to the Labour... manifesto.
Of course, it may well be, but I think there is a difference about how they might be delivered. So on growth, for example, I don't believe that, you know, the way that we better growth in this country is to pour money into public services. I'm almost certain that's what Labour will propose in its next manifesto.
And net zero, which you do agree with.
Which I do agree with net zero. But again, I think net zero is an aspiration that ties into those things. You know, when you look, I mentioned Tees Valley before, or if you go to Grimsby, you can see places being regenerated by the private sector with greater business investment to reindustrialize those kind of places. So the difference of emphasis, of course, is about the role of the state and the private sector. All these things I'm talking about is about empowering a better economy through the private sector, not just making the state bigger. And that's what growth is about. You know, if you take the tax burden, for example, of course I think the tax burden is too high at the moment. Of course it needs to come down. I can see all the reasons for that. The difference is I think that it has to be done in a logical way, based on sound money, in a sustainable way, not just doing it quickly and in a quick, fast way as we saw earlier last year. I don't think Labour's going to necessarily be talking about lowering taxes. They might want more growth, but they're going to look at doing it in a very different way. But I think fundamentally where British politics has got to now is all the places that need the help the most, those so-called left-behind towns that I've visited in broken heartlands, I've written a lot about, they are now the centre of political debate. And that is a wonderful thing. I love the fact that both parties are focused on this. I think that centre-right ideas for these places are the right ones and are working right now. But I'm very glad to see that Labour, which I think did not do enough in its 13 years of power for these places, is now trying to make up for that and try and do more about it under the guise of people like Lisa Nandy and Andy Burnham.
And how do you think that kind of conservatism, your kind of conservatism, would fend off the march of the right, you know, of reform and Farage and all of that?
Well, first of all, I think obviously Reform UK are there and they're doing quite well at the moment because people are quite unhappy with politics generally. And you see it's midterm blues is how I would put it, that you saw this with UKIP, you've seen this with the Liberal Democrats in a different part of the country for the Conservatives. When people get to the next election, they have to seriously think about how they're going to vote, who's going to run the country. And I think the reform threat will abate away because they're not going to form the next government. UKIP never got any MPs within Parliament. They obviously did shape the agenda and where things went in quite a big way. With regard to the
but if people, if people think come the next election the Conservatives are going to lose anyway, and that they're looking at a Labour government in some form, minority or majority. Might they not go, we need to stand up for our values, and maybe what we need is some Nigel Farage type MPs?
I disagree with that, you'll be shocked to say, because I think that what it is incumbent on the centre-right to make those arguments that fend off that, because I think when you saw the big collapse and declining UKIP, it was because the people on the centre-right had a cogent argument to speak to the reasons people might be looking towards reform. So if you take net zero, for example, Reform have made a big song and dance about the fact we can't afford net zero, which is just complete toss as an argument, because the fact is net zero is the quickest and easiest way to get to cheaper energy, to have a better base for the future. And I think, people on the centre-right need to be bolder in making those arguments, because if you don't, the kind of vacuous popular slogans you see from Reform can find a currency. And when we get past this particular period, which it is focused on delivery, the economy, that kind of competence level, places like Onward are putting forward those arguments. We run a big getting to zero program. We are focused on energy security. We are focused on how to make net zero work. But I think for the centre-right, if Reform UK are doing well, that means we have failed in our arguments and need to be better at what we're doing.
Because, the truth is also that if the Conservatives lose the next election, this argument here is going to be about the heart of the Conservative Party, isn't it? And who inherits the ruins, and whether it's what you would describe as, logical, centrist, sensible, way of thinking, or whether it's, what is quite common in these sort of situations, a surge of the right, core votes, core values. That's going to be the struggle, isn't it?
Well, obviously, I don't accept the next election is entirely lost.
Sure, yeah.
As I said, a lot can happen in 18 months. Let's see what happens at that point. And I think, if there was a scenario where the Conservatives don't win the next election, the question will then be about, why didn't the party win? Why didn't those centre-right values do well? And then how you can reassert them and figure out where we need to do things. I'm a big fan of planning reform, and I think that's something that has to be done. That's obviously not gone through Parliament at the moment. The Conservative Party will have to think why that is and how we can get to a place that we should have won that argument, because there was this 80-seat majority that Boris Johnson won in 2019. That majority, I think it has done some good things. I think the levelling up bill and all the funds there have been great. The devolution has been great. The progress on net zero, again, has been very good. There are other realms of the public sector that still require reform and have not gotten to the right place that they should be. So if it came to that scenario, yes, of course, there will be a debate within the party. But I think ultimately, if the Conservative Party wants to get back into power in the near future, it will be about the onward ideas, because the ideas we've put forward are what won the 2019 election, and I think will win the elections of the future.
We haven't talked much about your other book, The Fall of Boris Johnson. And I wonder whether that's because you may yet have to write another book called The Fall and Rise of Boris Johnson. How likely do you think that is?
Well, obviously there was that weekend where Boris Johnson thought about coming back. He tried to get back on the ballot in October the 21st at that point, and obviously it didn't work out that time. The question for Boris Johnson will be what are the circumstances that he might strive to come back? He obviously wants to remain active in politics as a figure. There's no doubt about that. And he obviously played a big role in Ukraine. And one of the things I talk about in the book is the fact that he has a very good track record, that he made a big call, as he did with the vaccine rollout, and got that big call on Ukraine absolutely right. And I think, there may well be some big international role that he can play with the reconstruction of Ukraine, or trying to bring Western countries together, as the war continues. With regards to Westminster politics, my feeling is Rishi Sunak is almost overwhelmingly likely to fight the next general election for the Conservatives. It would be to go through the process of changing leader again. And it would be very disruptive when, as I said, the focus has to be on competence for now, and then fresh ideas going into 2024. But, who knows what the politics could bring. Boris Johnson could return to the cabinet. I'm sure he would love to be foreign secretary again. He might want to have a punt at being leader again, but we'll see what happens in those circumstances.
In the context of the conversation we've been having, isn't one of the problems when you think about Boris Johnson is actually politically what he stands for beyond personality? And that are there big beliefs and core beliefs and thoughts there that you can say, yes, that is Johnsonian conservatism?
So a lot of people will often say there isn't a thing as Johnsonism. But at the end of my first book, I spent a whole day in Hartlepool with Boris Johnson. And that was obviously the by-election the Conservatives won for the first time ever. It was a huge shock, that result. And I think his point about the fact is that we are not doing enough for parts of the country that need the help the most. I think Boris Johnson genuinely believes in that he obviously was a big backer of Brexit in the 2016 referendum. And I think
But that may just be sort of clever electoral politics, that he knows that he's got to replace the voters he's losing in the south with voters in the north.
But the point of 2019 was that actually the Conservatives didn't lose that many voters in the south because, that slogan, get Brexit done. Yes, it was about reassuring Brexiters that they were going to deliver the Leave result, but it also said to Remain voters, we are on your side as well. And I think that was quite a clever thing that worked on both ends of that kind of spectrum. And I think there's no reason the Conservative Party can't maintain that 2019 coalition of both ends of it. And I think that's what Johnsonism was about. It was about levelling up for the red wall end. And by the way, with levelling up, a lot of people criticise the levelling up funds by picking a very leafy borough and saying, why are they getting the money? The fact is there are huge pockets of rural poverty outside the north and outside the Midlands at those red wall places. And we really don't do enough to focus on the things they need, which is obviously better broadband infrastructure, rural bus services, better very localized services within those places. So that, I guess, is what Johnsonism is about, combined with that, obviously, that boosterism, that optimism that his fans loved and his detractors found very irritating. But to a lot of those people, if you've lived in some towns where your GDP's been going backwards for quite a long period of time, and you've got someone who comes along who makes you feel better about yourself and gives you that vision, that does very well. Ronald Reagan's Sunshine in America, that was what Boris Johnson tried to do. It worked well for Ronald Reagan. It worked well for Johnson in 2019.
I just want to circle back to journalism and your route into this as well. Because, as you know, a lot of people, believe that there is this, there's an intrinsic right-wing bias within the newspapers, and that people like you, work in newspapers. You're in charge of editorial comment and opinion within newspapers, and then you sort of end up, and you're a conservative insider, and then you end up sort of shaping conservative policy as a think tanker, and who knows, you might end up in politics yourself one day. And this is what's wrong with sort of the alignment of politics and the media. How do you think about this? Do people have a point that there is a sort of a problem, a structural problem with the way people flit between politics and newspapers?
Well, the point I'd make within the fall of Boris Johnson is there were 3 Ps that I outlined that brought down Boris Johnson, which was Patterson, which was Owen Paterson, the disgraced former Environment Secretary, and his breaking of parliamentary rules. Partygate, which was about obviously the rule-breaking parties in Downing Street, and Pincher, Chris Pincher, the former Deputy Chief Whip accused of sexual harassment allegations. All 3 of those Ps were brought into the public realm by the media. So Owen Paterson was reporting by The Guardian into his affairs. That would not have happened were it not for that. Partygate, you had lots of reporting, obviously, by ITV, by the Daily Telegraph, that famous left-wing newspaper that printed lots of reporting about what happened there. And Pincher, that was exposed by the Sun newspaper as well. So if you look at all those 3 things that were there, they were all brought down by parts of the print media that people who would make that accusation would want to critique about it. My general view is that I've worked in four newspapers of all different editorial persuasions and world outlooks. I have genuinely never had a situation where anyone has lent on me to write or not write a story in a particular way. And I think some people give the media a lot more credit than it is due for the way it might shape political events. That when you're a journalist, you can nudge things in a particular direction. And when I wrote The Fall of Boris Johnson, I went through, millions of words of things that were written and reported on at the time. And then when I was sitting down to do the interviews about what was going on behind the scenes with people who were more willing and frank to talk because it was a book as opposed to day-to-day journalism, it was astounding me how much of it was completely on the nose. There was very few bits that people had not got right. And I thought, well, hang on a minute, there is no bias here because people are doing that. With regards to your question about the revolving door things, my view on that is, I don't see, there's an slightly odd thing in this country about, like, you know, if you go into politics, that's seen as like almost a bad thing. They're like, you know, if you're in the media, that's a wonderful, noble thing, but public service is actually quite a bad thing. And people who want to do one and go to the other, I find that very odd. In any other country, in America, I would often meet people when I worked at the Washington Post who would say, oh, one day I'm going to be the senator from Arizona, and one day I'm going to do that. If you went around the parliamentary press gallery and said, oh, one day I'm going to be the MP for whatever, people would look at you and think of you in a different way. And this is something about how we view politicians in our country. Maybe it's the longer term effects of the MP's expenses crisis and trust generally within our politics. But my general view is that if you're like me, you engage in politics, you want to get stuck into ideas, going from journalism to think tankery, I think it's a good thing to do, and I hope that the things that I was able to do and offer in journalism, I can offer and do slightly different things in the think tank world.
So are you prepared to take on that orthodoxy and say, yes, I do want to be a politician? I'm
willing to say, as I said to you earlier, that Onward is a full-time job, and I'm loving it, and that's my singular focus right now.
So if you could change the world in any way, wave a magic wand, what would you do?
I would be Cabinet Office Minister for one day, and I would radically change how the civil service works. I would go and give power to lots of mayors and create mayors very, very quickly, and I would simply try and change the fundamental structures of how the state works. And in that basis, that would create a whole platform for better decision making and fix the British state for the medium-term future.
Seb Payne, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for sharing your way to change the world.